One straight line drawn in a dark office. A million graves dug in the burning sun. This is the origin of the 100-year betrayal.
London, 1960. While the Arabian sun was searing the skin off T.E. Lawrence's face, a different kind of heat, was burning in a silent mahogany row office. There were no bullets here, only the scratching of a fountain pen. Mark Sykes didn't care about the tribal bloodlines or the ancient wells Lawrence was dying to protect. To him, the Middle East was a cadaver, and he was the coroner. He laid a cold steel ruler across the map, a guillotine blade for a continent. With one swift clinical stroke, he drew a line from the E in Acre to the K in Kirkuk. As the ink hit the paper, the desert thousands of miles away began to groan. Lawrence felt it in his marrow. Every time he promised an Arab sheikh a kingdom for his loyalty, the steel ruler in London pressed harder into the sand. He thought he was the architect of freedom, but he was merely the decorative gilding on a cage. Here is the visceral truth. The Great Arab Revolt was never a war for independence. It was a brilliantly choreographed funeral for a promise that was murdered before it was even whispered. From the deep surgical cuts Sykes made on that map, thick black oil and warm human blood erupted together, spraying upward in a synchronized geyser of greed and death. It drenched Lawrence's white robes, turning his symbol of purity into a heavy, suffocating rag of filth. He was the distraction. He was the bright, shining object held up to the sun so the Arabs wouldn't notice the knife being slipped between their ribs. London was gutting a continent, and Lawrence was the one holding the flashlight. The line drawn in that dark office didn't follow mountains or rivers. It sliced through families, separated fathers from sons, and locked 100 years of conflict into the dry earth. The ink was thicker than the blood being spilled, because once it dried, the betrayal became permanent. Lawrence stood in the center of the carnage, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He wasn't leading a revolution. He was decorating a robbery. If the hero is the one unknowingly holding the knife, then what do you call the martyrs who died screaming his name? October 1918. Damascus has fallen. The streets are still echoing with the cheers of the Arab Revolt, celebrating a freedom they believe they have finally won. T.E. Lawrence, pale, exhausted, and still wearing his filth-encrusted white robes, enters the temporary British headquarters, a once grand Ottoman palace room now stripped of its soul, replaced by field desks and military maps. He finds General Allenby and a cold-eyed French liaison officer, François-Georges Picot, standing over a table. They are not discussing the birth of a new Arab nation. They are discussing logistics, specifically the logistics of Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Lawrence, fueled by the adrenaline of victory and the desperate need to believe in his own lies, demands that Faisal's Arab government be recognized immediately, as promised. Allenby doesn't even look up. He moves a brass counter, representing a division, across a new map of Syria. Promises, Lawrence, are the currencies of war, Allenby says, his voice flat and clinical. Contracts are the laws of peace, and we have a contract. He points to the map. The surgical line Mark Sykes drew in 1916 has materialized. It is no longer an ink stain. It is a proposed railway and pipeline route designed to bypass French territory and secure British control over the Prens, oil fields of Mosul. Georges Picot smiles, a razor-thin expression of satisfaction. We are merely stabilizing the region, Major Lawrence, ensuring orderly governance. Orderly governance? Lawrence roars, his voice cracking. I promised them a kingdom. Thousands died screaming for that promise. And you give them a pipeline? Allenby finally looks at him, his gaze containing all the warmth of an Arctic winter. You promised them a future, Lawrence. We are securing their resources. Do not mistake sentiment for statecraft. He pushes a document towards Lawrence, the formal implementation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It details the division of Syria and Lebanon under French mandate, and Iraq and Palestine under British control. Faisal's kingdom is reduced to a landlocked, powerless shadow. Your role, Major, was to deliver Damascus, Allenby concludes. You have performed it admirably, but the curtain has fallen on the theater. This is reality. In that cold palace room, surrounded by the smell of expensive cigars and cheap victory, Lawrence realized his greatest achievement wasn't conquering a city. It was unknowingly constructing a magnificent stage, perfect for the British Empire to host its greatest robbery. He looks down at his hands, still stained with the crimson ink that seeped into the sand. It is no longer symbolic. It is the blood of a promise that was murdered before it was born. He didn't just lead a revolution, he decorated its grave. If the hero is the one unknowingly holding the knife, then what do you call the martyrs who died screaming his name? The abstract line drawn by Mark Sykes in 1916 has now been constructed in heavy iron. What began as a clinical scratch on a paper map has materialized into a grotesque, labyrinthine industrial complex built across the cracked and beaten desert floor. This apparatus does not look like a machine for transport. It looks like a brutal surgical instrument designed for systemic bleeding. Massive, rusting iron pipelines trace the precise surgical path from Acre to Kirkuk, replacing the desert's ancient caravan routes with corridors of steel. The cold logic of the empire now stands as a monument of industrial amputation. All along the line, metal valves are gaping, perpetually leaking thick, black crude oil that puddles on the ground like stagnant rot. But the machine is not just extracting fuel. Interspersed with the crude oil pumps are secondary systems with stylized blood drop symbols etched into their metal casings. Here, through a series of dedicated, cleaner steel pipes, thick, dark, crimson blood is being actively pumped and collected into massive, sterile holding tanks. The machinery does not differentiate between the resources. It simply sucks them from the same deep, agonizing wound. Near a central pumping hub, a massive, corrosion-encrusted iron sign stands, bearing the cold words, Implementation of Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1918. Smaller, faded metal markers at various junctions mark the sectors. Mosul, Damascus, the routes that were once dreams of independence. The abstract promise of freedom has been ground down, purified, and is now being barreled for export. If the promise was the currency of war, and the contracts were the laws of peace, then what did you call the mandates? A mandible, constructed to swallow a nation whole, separating its life from its blood. A single, exhausted Arab figure stands near the base of the massive structure, looking up at the monumental, wound-like complex. They are no longer revolutionizing. They are laboring to support the very machine that is extracting their past. The unheard scream of the sand has been refined into the low, constant, guttural, deep hum of massive, uncaring pumps. If the hero is the one unknowingly holding the knife, then what do you call the martyrs who died screaming his name? The transformation is complete, and it is far more cold and clinical than any nightmare. The surgical ink of 1916 has hardened into miles of rusted barbed wire and black iron pipelines that now sever the desert horizon. This is no longer a revolution. It is a permanent industrial occupation. Lawrence stands in the shadow of a massive British oil derrick, the rhythmic, guttural thumping of the steam pumps vibrating in his very bones. He doesn't see a ghost. He sees the truth. The Acre to Kirkuk line is no longer a scratch on a map. It is a deep, oil-choked trench guarded by men in khaki uniforms. The desert he loved is being systematically dismantled. The Mandible is not a machine he imagines. It is the treaty itself. He feels the weight of the Sykes-Picot Agreement closing in like a heavy, iron trap. Between the grinding gears of London's greed and France's ambition, the ancient valleys and sacred cities he promised to protect are being crushed. The map is buckling under the weight of the heavy boots and the relentless extraction of the earth's blood. This is the realization Lawrence feared in the silence of his Mahogany Row betrayal. He didn't lead a revolt. He cleared the path for a robbery. He was the one who held the flashlight while the Empire gutted a continent. The mandate isn't a promise of guidance. It is a cold, metallic mechanism designed to separate a nation from its future, grinding its history into a fine, exportable dust. The desert wind no longer carries the songs of the Bedouin. It only carries the oily stench of the pumps and the scream of the sand. The robbery is finished. The future is being consumed, one barrel at a time. The betrayal is no longer an event in history. It is the very mouth through which the future is being consumed, one promise at a time. The meal is finished, and the silence that follows is the heaviest of all. By 1935, the desert Lawrence once knew has been completely redefined. The map is no longer a dream of tribal sovereignty. It is a clinical ledger of extraction. The rusted pipes and barbed wire have become the permanent skeletal structure of a new Middle East, a landscape designed not for its people, but for its efficiency as a resource. Back in the damp grayness of England, Lawrence can still hear the rhythmic thumping of those distant pumps. It is the heartbeat of a system that ground a century of history into a fine exportable dust. He realizes now that he was never the architect of a nation. He was the one who greased the hinges of the trap. The mandate was the slow, mechanical process of swallowing a continent whole, and he was the distraction that kept the victim still. The Acre to Kirkuk line is no longer a fracture. It is a permanent scar, a deep trench where the lifeblood of the land is continuously siphoned into the bellies of foreign tankers. The Great Arab Revolt has been reduced to a footnote in a corporate contract. The robbery is no longer a crime, it has become the law of the land. Lawrence stands at the edge of his own life, looking not at the desert, but at the reflection of a man who realized too late that his heroism was the finest tool the empire ever owned. The machine is still closing, still grinding, preparing to swallow the next generation of promises. Final hook. The betrayal was never an event in the past. It is a permanent, mechanical rhythm, a mouth that is still closing, still consuming the future, one generation at a time.